It is time for another Pay Practitioners panel. Happy every other Friday. This is one of the happy Fridays where we can kind of get back together and talk about all things comp. So today I'm pretty excited about the conversation because we're going to be talking about what does the compensation practitioner need to know about pay equity. And I think this is something that's very frequently comes up and has continued to come up, and it's coming up more and more and more. We've got great folks on our panel today that will have a really great deal of insight around what the comp team should know. So we'll go around and introduce ourselves, and then we'll kind of jump into the discussion. But my name is Justin Hampton. I'm the founder of Comp Tool. I am currently living in Mexico City for another week or so, then headed back to Playa del Carmen. I have been a compensation practitioner for about 15 years before I started the Comp Tool. And we were actually just recently highlighted as one of the most innovative compensation management softwares per Lighthouse Research. So we're really excited for that. And we are hiring a couple of roles. So if you are interested in a fairly entry-level comp analyst role, we'd be happy to talk to you there. And we've got a couple other folks that are also looking to hire. Mod Pizza is hiring for a fairly senior comp analyst role, individual contributor. And there was one more that I'll have to come back to, but we'll pass it off to the next person. Catherine, I think that's you on my side.
It is. Hi, Catherine Dovey with Sound Compensation. Been doing compensation consulting for about 25 years and love every minute of it. I've worked in a lot of different industries, so tend to work with the small to mid-sized businesses, and I do a lot of nonprofit exec comp as well.
Great. Jennifer.
Hi there, Jennifer Hastrick. Been in comp for about 20 years as well. Primarily focus on broad-based compensation systems and pay equity. So very excited to talk today with all of our team here.
Great. Well, Sherry, how about you?
Hi, I'm Sherry Nornis. I'm with Morgan HR. I've been in the consulting field only a couple of years, but have almost 3 decades of compensation broadband-based work. We are also, looking for people. So if you want to just reach out to me, we're looking for a little more senior than Justin, but we'd be happy to talk with you.
All right, Jaime.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jaime Morfim. I'm a managing partner with Sueldos.com, which is a small compensation and data-driven company based in Mexico City with coverage in in Central America and the Caribbean. Great to be here again.
Great. Nancy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Romanishin. I work for Syndio. We were actually just named in the top 20 of Fortune's companies that are changing the world, which is really it's pretty exciting, I have to say. So we're a workplace equity analytics platform focused on pay equity and opportunity equity. And I'm Senior Director, Total Reward Strategy and Solutions, been in the comp space for probably about 30 years, a little bit more than there, believe it or not. Great to be here.
No, well, and I always, very appreciative and grateful of everybody spending a couple of minutes with us every other Friday. So looking forward to the conversation today. And so as we kind of get started, it seems like there's been a lot of changes in pay equity over the last several years. There's been a real drive and push to that. I just want to kind of open it up, and whoever wants to jump in can answer it. But what are the biggest changes that we expect to see going forward with pay equity? Any predictions on kind of if we'll continue to see it grow or if we'll continue to see additional requirements added?
I mean, I have lots of, I was gonna say I have lots of opinions. Jennifer, why don't you begin?
I mean, it's a tide, right? I mean, it started on one coast, and on the other coast we have some in the middle, and it's not an if, it's a when. From what we're seeing, and there's a cascading. Even if there aren't legislation or rules within a particular market, there's impact. Because from compliance and just peer pressure in some ways. So I think it's going to continue. It's going to continue to be part of the conversation. And it's going to continue to be something that comp teams are going to have to be aware of and focusing on.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think it even goes to, I think compensation practitioners in these years, it's going to be a new skill set that they're all going to be able to do. And you're going to have to, because it'll be foundational to our programs. I always joke, when we've all designed programs, right, we design them to be fair. There was no sort of intention that there should be inequities, and yet we see that when we do the analytics. So I think just being better at and doing the analytics, embedding that in your comp management processes, I think that's what we're going to see, just much more of that. And right, Jennifer, like we've seen it sort of come out of darkness. It's been this thing that used to be over there. It was this audit nobody talked about, and now it's front and center.
Yeah.
And so vital, and just part of the conversation about pay.
Yeah. And really beyond just the checkbox. It's not a one and done. It's an every year process, embedding it into every year's conversation and how things are designed.
Yeah, and you hit on it, Nancy, when you talked about the foundational piece, right? Is you really can't measure the pay equity accurately without having that foundational compensation structure in place that executive leaders have agreed to, because at the end of the day, that's kind of the key, is to make sure that you have that foundation for pay transparency. And oh, by the way, it's really good for pay equity too. It's like, it's not one and done for sure, but that first step to do pay equity can be kind of scary. But if you kind of step back and think about it, it's just getting all the pieces of the puzzle together.
And so, and as we think of kind of what's coming forward, what have we seen people doing today, and where do we think that maybe some things that are being done, are there any gotchas? Or I've seen some scary pay equity studies, studies, but I'm curious, when we think of the different technologies and the different ways that it's being done out there, what are the biggest problems that we've seen with it, how it's been done by companies today? And kind of where do we think that there's probably opportunities for companies to really say, I probably need to change the way we're doing things, or to kind of start to do that self-assessment?
Great question. I know from on my side, I'm seeing more of a standardization approach and an expectation of what needs to be reported, even if it's high level. I think organizations are often guarded with the information because they don't know what story to tell. And going to Sherry, to your point, what is that story and what's the foundation? And you have to have that before you can tell your story, and so then how do you tell those numbers? So I think there's, while pay transparency has its own outputs of, variability of short ranges, at least in the publicly traded side, that unadjusted gap is, kind of an expectation. And then that, regression analysis piece, how you do it is there's variabilities, but that's the other piece, kind of boiling it down to where we kind of starting to see some standardization.
Yeah, I think, obviously our company is all about this. It's the core of what we do. So, and we've grown and we have a lot more customers. And I think that's just a testament to companies addressing it more deeply, building a cadence around it, but also we're seeing a huge change management happen within organizations, where you're seeing Total Rewards partnering with the legal team, sharing in this, partnering with other parts of HR, and coming around data and analytics. And then to your point, Jennifer, telling the story. What is the story that we're going to tell internally, to leadership, to our employees? How do we prove it in the era of transparency? I have to prove that we pay fairly. So how exactly are we going to do that? And then with the legislation coming up, I think, we have legislation in place now, but the EU directive is like the earthquake. It is the massive change that I really I don't know how else to describe it. It's just setting this whole new standard of transparency for pay equity. It's absolutely outlining that across the European Union. Pay gap, all manner of metrics, and being very transparent with employees and the world. So I think companies are, like you're saying, trying to take control of their stories, making sure that they have their houses in order, and then going forth and figuring out how exactly do we communicate it. And it's for them.
Yeah, that change management. Wow, right? That has to be almost started and in the process before you even get into the pay equity part of it, right? We have to change the whole direction that our company is looking at pay. And you know what? We're going to have to be a little vulnerable and own what we have today and where we're going. And those are kind of hard things to do with employees, but you know what? It's building that trust that at the end of the day, when you get that in analytics and you're making some changes, now you've got them, right? That's what we're trying to do, is just build that trust with our employees that we're doing the right things.
I'm sorry, Sherry, what do you mean by vulnerable? If you can elaborate a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, because if they're looking at their current structure and they see lots of opportunity for maybe a makeover or updating some of the ways they're viewing jobs or communicating to their employees, titles maybe are misaligned, so expectations are not there. So it's that vulnerability for the organization to be able to step back and say, hey, we're going to take a look at this because this is important to us. So, it's being that vulnerable kind of to open up the door and say, hey, we're going to take a crack at this and do our best to honor, you as our employees.
Understood. Go ahead, Catherine. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You go, Jamie.
Just very quickly, we continue to see, at least on the region that we manage, a huge discussion between a couple of the generations. The older generation coming, having the old ways of managing people by performance. That would be the main reason for paying their teams. And the new generations coming with a new perspective, more ethical perspective, considering, for example, pay equity as one of the elements. It is a huge struggle, and many things that we do as consultants probably come up with a commitment or a compromise between those perspectives, and have a different perspective on paying people, particularly bonuses and commissions, anything that it's variable. So it is a huge issue. Probably, I think I said this before on the previous conversation. It is also a divide between international companies and local companies that are having these discussions. And for employees, they're not really sure what to do and what to expect in that regard. So it's a really company from company policy. We cannot say that it's on an overall perspective from either the country or the region. So we need to go one company by company to find out and see how we can manage pay equity in this matter.
Absolutely. One of the things I think about pay equity is, I know it's become a thing, but good compensation practices have always paid attention to pay equity. I mean, going back 20 years, I can remember having very in-depth conversations with one example, a guy who had his two son-in-laws working for him, making $250,000 a year, and his best employee, who was not related to him, who was a female, making $160,000 a year. And, you have a come to Jesus meeting about that stuff. We've always done that. We're just focusing a little bit more. And I think in the smaller companies, especially, you can't always run regression models. So just having that awareness makes a huge difference. And just having, as Sherry was saying, having structure, having practices in place where you're looking at those models and paying attention to it, the things automatically pop out. It's shocking, really, if you look at it.
Yeah, I think it's that conflation, right, of pay transparency and pay equity that we're seeing, to your point, Catherine, that it's just, as things become more transparent, it is putting pressure on being able to explain why we pay what we pay. So we call it explainability. So it's essentially, I think, making sure that we're running the robust analytics, that we're digging into those causes. It's just becoming part of that. I agree. I think, Jaime, it goes to kind of what you're saying. How do we have this open discussion, right, with different groups of employees that may have different expectations? So beginning from this place of, this is what we say we pay for, and making sure that that's actually what we're doing. I think those are it sounds really simple, but like that's what I'm finding that this new muscle around analytics is helping us do, is get much more precise and dig into that. And then to your point, Shari, doing it from a place of vulnerability. That, yep, we're delivering on this. We're not satisfied with how we're delivering here. And so, but these are the things we're working on. Focusing on process, not necessarily the current outcome or a number. We find with a lot of the folks we work with, that's what employees really relate to. They don't expect to be the top paid, but they want to know that there's a process in place that they're paid fairly. That's vitally important.
Tagging on to that, I think that perception of unfairness is just as real as the actual number, and then actually it's the emotional piece, right? And so oftentimes that's just as important. And I think what's changed is, yes, we've always built these systems, and yes, they've been there, but no one's talked about them in the way that we're talking about them today. And I think that shining the light has created this interesting thing in the comp world. Like, people actually care what we do, right? People actually are curious of what we do. And I think one thing I've seen is you can have a beautifully built system, but how it's applied and used is where we find so many of the issues, because either culturally it's an entrepreneurial, pitted against each other by unit, and they can have their own little fiefdoms, and they don't know what the rules are, and they don't understand that what they're doing here impacts the rest of the organization, or there's just very loose guidelines of interpretation. That's what we often see. So even in a beautifully designed system, there's often rooms for that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think that goes to the definition of fairness. What exactly are we talking about in terms of fairness? Is it the number of hours that people work? Is it really the results? It is gender. It is age, number of years that you've been working with the company. I think it's very difficult. And Jennifer, you touch a crucial element, which is culture. That varies from culture to culture, and a standard definition, from a US-based, European-based company across the world is not going to work. You're going to have a lot of problems trying to define or bring your own values or cultural values into the table and try to define that definition of fairness across, different cultures. It's not going to fly. It's going to be very difficult to implement. So, are you seeing these internationally from those who have operation outside of the US?
Yeah, I would say, Jaime, I think what you're getting at is, right, the segmentation that we're seeing. And I think we're going to continue to see that in the world of rewards across the board. So whether it's how we define fairness, how we define performance, right, that nuance, making sure that we're also segmenting the workforce based on how they're contributing to our business results. I think we're just going to continue to see that play out. Again, driven and really forced by transparency, because you have people kind of questioning that. Well, I don't understand why you're defining fairness like that. That doesn't apply to me here, in this job, right? Or how we operate, or our culture in this plant where we're working. So I think it's really thinking about. A lot of folks are really considering their compensation philosophies and how does that play out in different markets, in different businesses. So I think, and then ensure that we have some rigor around that we've designed and modified and refined our comp programs to drive across those definitions in a consistent way.
Yeah.
Right.
I really like that perspective, talking about, that philosophy and the culture driving the thinking around pay and around equity. I personally am pretty uncomfortable with the word fairness, because fairness seems to be in the eye of the beholder many times. So one of the things I do with my clients is I talk about the 4 equities external equity, internal equity, individual equity, and process equity. And we didn't used to talk, we've always had those elements, but we didn't, to your point, didn't used to talk about that stuff. It was something that we did in the back room. Compensation knew about it, but we didn't mention the fact that we're using process equity to manage pay. And so I've had really good luck sharing the construct with those 4 elements. I feel like breaking, especially at least in the smaller companies, that the small to mid-sized companies that I've been working with, it's really resonates with people and they're going, oh yeah, I get it. Like we have to use the same salary structures, or not the same structures, but we have to use the same process, the same rigor around how we set the pay ranges to begin with. And then we have to look at how that impacts, you know, individuals who are performing well versus those who aren't, versus long tenured folks versus folks with tribal knowledge that nobody else has, or special skills, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I think the more I focus on those 4 equities and less on fairness, it feels to me like I get better traction.
Mm-hmm. I like that framework. I usually just think of the 2, right? I mean, I know the other ones are out there, right? The process and visual, but oftentimes we only focus on the internal and the external, right? Mm-hmm. I like that. And it's really about that balance of freedom and framework, right? That you're using in all 4 dimensions. That's a great one.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, you know, one size does not fit all with pay equity. We all want the same goal, but the process that we use internally is different for small companies versus global companies, you know? And I think it's that ability to just kind of lean in on what you have, kind of tear it apart, because there's so many good nuggets doing this analysis that you'll find not only in the pay, but in your processes, your hiring processes, your promotion processes. It's just, I mean, I don't want to say it's not about pay, because it is. That's the foundation of pay equity. But there's so many more opportunities that come forth when you start to break that information down, and you got to embrace it, right? Just lean right in and take a hold of it, and share it with your leadership. They don't know what they don't know. And framing it in that standpoint of the analytics that we have, and transforming it into something that they can see as part of your business strategy, that'll go a long way.
Oh, Shari, I love that. I mean, yeah, I think you're so right. There's so much information that you are able to unpack about how you're actually delivering pay in practice. And I'm sure you have experienced the surprise. People,
oh yeah,
wait, what? It's doing that. So I think to that point, right, we don't know what we don't know, and it's so powerful to unpack that. And then it can be daunting, right? It can be overwhelming. So then it becomes a prioritization exercise around, okay, what do we want to tackle first and address, you know, in an incremental way.
Right.
That's what I find folks are doing.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you guys have all worked in organizations where you have this great system, you've built this tool, everybody's on board, and then the execs or some key manager with lots of informal power comes in and makes a pay decision that kind of upends the apple cart. Have you guys seen that happen?
Constantly, yeah, absolutely.
Oh yes.
The better question is, who hasn't seen it happen?
Yeah, fair point.
Right, exactly.
There.
And do you guys have any tips and hints on what to do in that situation? Because that's what these guys out here are dealing with in the real world, in the trenches, right?
Yeah.
We get to make up these really cool policies and practices and then walk away.
Oh yes. Every pay equity study that I do, we always have executive interviews. So you kind of do it proactively. And those I use as not only buy-in, but education. And you sometimes get the ahas, and you may not change that individual or that type of leadership style immediately. But typically, once it starts becoming a part of the conversation and part of the process, I see some of that coming down, and they start seeing, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? So it takes time. It's not an overnight transformation, but those internal reviews, like at high level executive interviews, I find some of the more powerful parts of a project.
Mhm.
We actually built in functionality to help companies manage that. So it's doing the pay equity analysis, but then using the benefit of your internal pay equity analysis to set all other pay decisions outside of, say, your merit cycle. So it's using that tool to pull that through and then disseminating that information for talent acquisition teams, for HRBPs, anybody making those pay decisions around promotions, around starting pay. So we just to your point, Catherine, to really operationalize, right, and keep people within guidelines so they don't undo the work that they just did. But it's a huge education effort as well.
Right.
So is there visibility in your systems? Because Nancy, you're working at a, big enterprise level that not all of us are working at. When you have those systems, is there visibility somewhere to the executive team that shows them like what decisions have been made or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
think, and I agree, right, with you, with Jennifer, like you're saying, a lot of times the work that's being done you have to have that buy-in if you're
Right.
going to really be able to enforce it. So it's sort of that balance of the strategy, bringing that to the executive team. Typically, like sometimes I call it like I'm a guest role. Guest, like I pop in to to a board meeting, like, hello, I'm Nancy. And but talking about the pay equity analysis with the leadership team, and then talking about what folks are doing right to operationalize that, but then actually having a plan for how do we operationalize it? How do we make sure that every pay decision is done with internal equity in mind? So,
Yeah.
and which is hard, right, with small comp teams. So it's about, right, making sure, like, is there a way that we can create functionality where you have a comp person sort of present for all of those comp decisions?
One of the things I did for some of my smaller clients who don't have that big infrastructure build out and don't have enough employees to do true regression analysis for the pay equity analysis is I've had them start doing a quarterly statement, basically, that says these are our exceptions. This is what happened last quarter with the exceptions. Here's the managers who didn't follow the rules, if
Oh,
you will. And they bring that to the executive meetings they're expected to bring that to the executive team every quarter. And I found that really highlights like who the players are who aren't playing and helps have the executive team have a conversation about, well, maybe we need to change the rules, or maybe the system we have isn't doing what we want it to do, but minimizing more of that informal, behind the scenes kind of decisions that get made that aren't always the best.
I love that, Catherine. What a great
good idea.
way to, right, affect change, because it's holding them accountable. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to that idea around transparency, right? At the end of the day, leadership needs to be made aware and they need to be bought into it, or else it's not going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that we see when implementing, pay equity models, that in our case is very much based on the valuation of the positions, is that we establish a framework of discussion, the standard valuation committee, and as long as you have that power struggle, which is really a power struggle within the organization, at least if you're working with upper management, everything wants to bring the best to their teams or themselves sometimes. As long as it happens there within a limited constraint and it doesn't go outside of the company, I think it's fair enough that you as a consultant you're really making things happen. I love the idea of following up, with ongoing process, quarterly or at least annually, to review what's happening with this process. Because sometimes, like you said, it becomes the financial guy, which is the godfather of the owner of the company, and that's it. It won't happen because he will force his own values of how to pay with the company because he managed the money. So it happens frequently with small companies and even mid-sized companies here in Latin America.
Pardon me. And one of the things that I have seen historically, and it's been a few years since I've worked for a company other than CompTool, but one of the things that I always kind of viewed was a bit of fear from the executive leadership team in terms of what are we going to find out, and then what do we have to do? Because, oh my gosh, if we find that we have, if we do have a pay inequity, then we'll have to address it. And that's going to be very expensive. So, I like to think about, how do you get started? Can you do it yourself? What should you be aware of? What data do you need? I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat kind of asking specifics around some of the data. I know that there are tools out there that can be done online. I know Glassdoor had a pretty interesting kind of a case study and a sample that if you've got access to RStudio, you can run your own regression model. But if you don't know how to interpret that or what it means, I think then you start to get into problems, because I've seen so many kind of probably less than formalized studies where they just say, if it's within 5%, it's okay. But I always kind of say, well, why 5%? Why not 4.8%? Why not 4? Why not 6? What is it actually? So I'll just open this up for, how should companies get started? How should they manage the fear? What data should they have? And, what's that first step they should take?
So many questions, Justin.
Well,
first and foremost, talk about the fear. All of our projects, we recommend to you get legal counsel protection first, because you don't know what you're going to find. You might find a good story, you may find a bad story, but that protects you legally from a risk perspective. One, from the discovery process, if you ever get a claim, but just it's good common practice, whether it's internal or external. I think, I see a lot of questions about the data, and I love Nancy's take on this as well. But, you can only study what you have, right? And one of the questions was about external experience education. That is often not collected, and we rarely use it because it's not something that we're able to collect on a consistent basis. So things of your time at the organization, time in your role. Sometimes we use age as a proxy for the experience to show, to at least have some element of that. But certainly your job level, so collecting all of these things. And that's a part right there, our job level. How do you compare job size? Often stops people from doing a study because they don't have a system in place. They don't have the foundation built yet. And so that's one that, how are you going to measure job size? And then, are there things that otherwise, you want to think about what can in fact affect pay in your organization, and can you put it in the model? So that's kind of the way to start thinking about, what data do you have? What does affect pay? Are there exceptions that, and differences in markets that you can account for? And then start either engaging internally if you have the experience, or externally with a consulting firm, a consultant, a platform like Syndio, and there's lots of partners out there. But doing your first one usually is helpful to have somebody that's done it before.
Yeah, I agree, Jennifer. And I agree really all the things said around that process. It's really, we find, companies, that's what it is. They want to partner because it's high stakes stuff. So to your point, Justin, right? Like we can do the math. The math can be complex, but we can do the math. It's not about the math. It's about, well, what do I do next? Or am I looking at things in the way I should be looking at them? Or am I looking at them in a way that's legally, compliant? So those are the types of things that a lot of times, the folks that we're working with, they want to be able to partner with somebody that's going to coach them through it, but they want their hands in the data because they want to be able to then think about things like years of experience, right? Or how are we going to look at experience? Do we look at time and role, time at the company, age as a proxy? How do we want to calculate it? And the beauty is, that's why we have a team of data scientists and economists that work with you, right? To say, well, here are some different ways you can do it based on what you have. And like you said, Jennifer, just getting started with what you have. I think it's some of the points we even made, Sharon, that you had made before. You'd be surprised how much you have. Nobody has perfect data. No one. But boy, you do have an awful lot of information. If you're paying people, then you probably have a rationale for how you're paying people. And we could probably suss that out together, doing the analytics, and then make some decisions about what do we feel confident to take action on? What don't we feel confident to take action on? And it's always good, again, most of our customers work under attorney-client privilege. They're working with attorneys as one of those partners in that team to make those decisions, just so that they're doing it in a safe manner. Those are the types of things. But I think you have to kind of start somewhere, Justin. I would it's sort of, let's just start because and that's what a lot of companies are deciding, because there's just too much out there and they need to take control of their story.
Yeah, no matter how perfect your structure you think it is, you're going to find something, right? And it was interesting. I had a conversation with a leader and we were talking about pay equity. He says, I have to see the model. I have to verify that the model's good. I said, you don't have to worry about the math. I'd sit back and think about how you're going to deal with what happens when the math shows you that how decisions are being made. I mean, that's the real change management piece that you have to grab a hold of. The data is the data, right?
But I'm sorry. But just thinking about Nancy and Jennifer was saying that it is the first thing to do is take the picture, how you are, and do the initial analysis. Even in that decision, there's an ethical question. What kind of data are you going to looking for in order to take that picture? No, so I would say in that initial, there has to be at least a certain level of discussion with an external consultant, which might be the best guidance before taking that picture, and then from that point, once you have the picture, have a second discussion to see how it's going to proceed in terms of implementation.
And yeah, it's a great point, because it's interesting too, because different states have different guidelines and what's included as being considered as equitable.
Yep.
Right. What can you add in as an equitable factor? We can just look at any state, pull up and see what there's differences in what is included, and they're usually greater than what is included in the federal law. So it's keeping that in mind with getting those compensable factors that you want to consider in place. You're absolutely right, Jaime.
And to your point too, I think it's about that process. Like a lot of times we're working with folks, the first we'll outline milestones, what's the expectation. So we're going to address, say, near-term risks. We'll make adjustments, and we're going to do that in time for the annual compensation planning. So that becomes a sort of a guiding point of, let's do some initial analysis, and then whatever we feel confident in, we can do then. And then we're going to, though, go further and continue to iterate and look at some different things for different maybe purposes. So maybe it's about doing diagnostics on our comp programs that aren't really about pay equity from a compliance point of view, but really understanding, hey, this looks out of whack. This is not how we intend to pay people. So let's go after that. So those to me are sort of those longer term risks. Even, looking at the makeup of the population, things like that. But it's right. It's beginning with this idea of, these are the commitments I think, we're going to go forward with. We're committed to looking at this, understanding what we have first, and then we'll determine what we're prepared to take action on. And usually to your point, Sherry, there are so many different specific requirements. So what we try to do is do something that's broad, look at a lot of different things, in different levels, so that way we can make sure that we're being compliant, but also satisfying a lot of the other questions that we end up asking of the data.
I'm curious if you guys have any numbers. Like, have you seen, what's the worst case scenario you've seen? What's the best case scenario you've seen? I know that most of the time the execs, their resistance to even tackling this is, it's going to cost us a ton of money. We can't afford it. So I'm curious, like, what's that span looked like in your worlds?
In percent of payroll would probably be the easiest way to think of it. Yeah. I mean, the numbers I've seen is, a typical range is 0.2, 0.4%, right? That's kind of annual, but on a project, I'll see double to triple that. So anything over 1% to 1.5% of payroll of dollar amount, and that's talking about extreme outliers. That is not talking about and that's just moving, and that's a gradual movement. I mean, I don't know, Nancy, you probably can calculate all the way to getting them to that predicted, and you're going to see much, much higher numbers.
Yeah. No, depending on the methodology that you're using for remediation. So usually we don't do too predicted. We do sort of it's a proportional response, I would call it, without getting too much into the details of that. But it's lower economic impact per person, but across a wider swath of people, I would say, to kind of change the pay story. But what I would say, I think the numbers that you're saying, Jennifer, like, again, 0.5% of payroll might be a good ballpark in terms of budgeting. What we find, we run research actually on how folks are addressing pay equity, whether they're setting a budget line item. We're seeing that more often, but I would say, Catherine, it's still common that they fold it into the merit increases. So it's kind of hard to distinguish. They make it part of, but I think it goes back to kind of what we started at the top of the hour, that pay equity is becoming just part of your regular compensation processes. Just like you do market analysis and you're going to do adjustments, you're doing pay equity analysis to do adjustments, again, to make sure that you're maintaining compensation hygiene, if you will.
Right. I think thank you guys so much, because I think it's important that's been my experience too, is there's always one or two crazy outliers, within a particular department. And then there's like, everybody else is not way off. And I think a lot of executives especially are really concerned about, like, I can't afford a 10% hit. That's what they have in their head, right? But if we can tell them statistically, it would be very unlikely. I'm just thinking about the folks who are listening to the call here about how they can sell it. I think if they have a number that's like, statistically, it's usually 1% or less, or often 1% or less. We can't promise that, of course. But if they have that kind of working framework in their heads, it might be an easier sell.
Well, and something too to kind of think about is that if you didn't get into the situation overnight, you're not going to get out of it overnight either. Right. And it's going to be a continual every year. So just build into the budget, say 0.5% per year, knowing you're going to dedicate that much to start pushing the envelope and pushing the gap, because you're always going to have gaps, year over year. So just making it part of kind of what we've said, previously, of like, it's part of the conversation, it's part of the process. Now build it into the budget, a segment to be able to take care of it. So you're not surprised, every year.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder too, I mean, like you said, you can't get out of it overnight. So that also suggests there are multiple people responsible for managing and maintaining the pay equity piece of it. Because I think a lot of times what you would see is, comp, we'll build the ranges and kind of trust typically the line managers or partner with the recruiting team will be the ones that kind of create those offers that are hopefully considering both internal and external equity. But oftentimes they may not have the tools or that broad view that they would need to make sure they are preparing internal equitable roles. So I'm wondering if we've seen any good practices in terms of how do line managers, how do recruiting, how does compensation interact together over the course throughout the year to make sure that you're keeping on that apex line if it was a kind of a race. I'm curious. I mean, are there tools out there that help us do that? Is there processes in place that you've seen that have been really effective in maintaining it over time?
Justin, you're like teeing me up here. So thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, there are. So yeah, I mean, one, there's, we have something called Pay Finder. And so what it is it is teeing up exactly that, where you're allowing access for talent acquisition. So the comp team is curating a view of ranges by job for folks that are making pay decisions so that they stay within that equitable range. But it also brings in, say, the market range or the salary range. So you just have the benefit of these different guidelines, but just keep it some tighter guardrails. I mean, I think that's what we're headed toward. So, I mean, as we talk about, just like you said, Jennifer, like it's an ongoing thing. It's something that we're going to continue to do, but it does raise the question, Justin, around what you were just getting at, which is pay decision making, pay decision processes. Who should have decision rights around pay? And how tight will these guardrails be around different elements of pay potentially going forward, especially as base salary is out there?
Right.
I just think pay transparency is going to start to narrow a lot of that, and you're not going to have as much discretion. So then I wonder how much, hopefully there will be less pay inequities as we get tighter around how we're governing pay decisions, right?
It's interesting, right? And this gets to Jaime a little bit in the how it has evolved. Been doing this for a while, and from being a part of the team to don't ask comp because comp will say no. So let's leave it up to the business. And now let's do some pay equity and look who's back at the table. And I don't want this to appear that we should have been there all along. But to be honest, there's always has to be a measurement, and it gets down to that governance, right? What governance are you going to agree to put in place? How do you partner with talent who's listening to the leader? How do you make this all work out? It's a process that it's all about the process, right? So, and I want to talk a little bit about that fairness, right? That piece that we had, that we talked a little bit about, one of those equitable measures of individual. Somebody asked in the chat, what is individual equity? Well, that really gets into that fairness piece, right? Fairness is in the eyes of the beholder, whether I feel that it's fair. And all we can do as comp professionals, I think, is to make one of the mantras that we have at Morgan HR is make pay feel fair, relevant, and right. That's kind of what we're trying to do to help that employee with that individual fairness, that individual equity. We can't make them feel that way. They have to feel it on their own. And we can't please everyone. So it's all we can do is do our best, I think.
Well, can I just tag on to individual equity for a minute? I mean, one of the ways we can add a little bit of rigor to that process is to get really clear about what we're paying for at the individual level. Are we paying for tenure? Are we paying for performance? What does performance look like? Are we using the same performance management system for the entire organization? Do we have managers who haven't calibrated? That's the part, I think, with regard to the individual piece that we can help codify and help structure a little bit more. And you're right, it is always, we can't make people feel like, yeah, it's fair. All we can do is tell them the processes and the systems that we're using, and and they have to trust that we're
That's the part.
managing that consistently across the organization, right? That's the tough part.
Yeah.
The communication is the key. Sorry,
No. Just to say that as long as the employees feel there are ethical questions behind the rationale of how they get paid, I think we're doing a great job if we have that into the system, because there's so many things. I think it was Nancy who said that there's so many elements that they need to be considered when we say pay equity, that is very difficult to really manage. I'll add something that it probably only happens in the developing countries like ours, which is poverty. That's a external equity element. Yeah, you probably have, of course, there's poverty in developed countries, but it's probably the impact is much less than in this country. So with that in mind, I'll say that the external elements in our countries make them much more complex than the countries like the US and some other developed countries.
I think we're seeing that even with living wage and how that's being interpreted right in different areas, or even if we start to get into benefits equity and think about social determinants of health and like all of these. But yeah, the complexities, Jaime, you're right. It's, what is equity? What is equitable? What is fair? What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? I think it goes to this idea of that you had raised around, has fairness changed? Our definition of fairness over, say, the past 20 years. And I certainly think it has. I like to think for the better, I hope, because I think there's a lot more awareness just about the things that you're raising. That everybody is, coming to the party in the same way, and that if you believe, say the Edelman Trust Barometer, right? The latest, I think the latest statistics, it was, who do people trust? CEOs. They're looking to, leaders of organizations to change the world, which is fascinating when you think about it. But I think employees just have such a different relationship with their employers now, and they have a whole new set of expectations. And I think that it directly impacts how we think about rewarding them and engaging them, and the fact that they have a say in how we reward them in a way that they didn't before. Now that they have all this information, they're at the table just in a whole different way now.
Nancy, I think you're spot on. I think fairness, the definition of it hasn't changed per se, at least in my eyes, but what comes into the conversation has. Yeah. And there's so many, they're more, employees are more educated. We have more data available. And so there's more of a vocal, part of it as well, and expectation, and communicating and partnering, I think, is the biggest part of this as well. That, change management, going from the beginning of our conversation, it's about change management, it's about communication, and it's about, a whole new landscape that we're in. It's not just about numbers at all.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, does that pay for performance piece of it erode the idea of pay equity? Because I know we've kind of touched on this in previous conversations, and I see Paul's comment about kind of getting rid of performance ratings. Because to me, there is a challenge when you want to have someone that has, if you need to recognize a high performer, it can't be 4% versus 3%. That's not a material differentiation. But over time, if you do recognize those performers and a promotion is not justified, over the time, you're going to see that gap of pay equity changing. And I know that performance is a compensable factor, but are we equipped to track it over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then to come back and explain why that gap exists? Or should we, just rely on variable pay to recognize performance versus base pay? I think we're going to see changes happening over the next several years with pay transparency and the focus on pay equity.
Do we have another hour? Because we could just talk about performance and pay equity. So let's just keep going. No, it's so true about the pay for performance piece. And, I think as with everything, we look to one system to solve a problem, right? We look for performance. Let's have 10 differentiators versus 1. Let's have none. Then we don't have to deal with a 2.3 differential in performance, right? So it brings about a great question, but also when it comes back to pay equity, decide what you want to do, right? It's all about making that systematic changes to align with your business strategy. So
yeah, I 100% agree. I feel like there's so much work to do around defining performance and defining it differently based on different segments of the organization and what, expectations, and being what everybody's been saying, just crystal clear about what it is that we pay for. But first and foremost, how are we even measuring performance? What does that even mean? What are you as an employee or the team or the business doing, right, to drive performance? So I think I agree, Justin. I'm in the latter camp, that I think base pay is going to get a lot more fixed, a lot simpler. Yeah. And what's going to happen is variable pay is really going to get more nuanced.
That total comp piece.
Yeah.
And to Jill's question in the chat, she asked, what about, should we do total comp? Absolutely. When you look at a study, you want to look at both, because that's for all of these reasons. And there's often discretion in some of that as well. And that's where you can also find some opportunities for change.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen narrowing of pay bands. People used to have these really broad pay bands, and I've seen this narrowing. And even one of the CEOs that I was working with at a fairly large company, she just she just said, no, we're only using the interquartile range. We're not going to these outside edges. I'm really uncomfortable going that far, creating that much divergence. I don't think we can explain because we don't have good processes internally around the internal equity piece. And I think that's going to continue.
Well, the bottom quartile in a range pretty much went away in the pandemic, right? Nobody could hire at 80%, right?
Right.
So,
Not in these markets.
hear that.
Wow. Well, yeah, pardon me. There's a lot to think about. So we just got a couple of minutes left, so maybe we'll use the last 5 minutes or so to do just kind of a final thought. And I'll go last because that person's typically at the most disadvantaged position, so I don't want to pick anyone. But I'll sum it up. But if anyone else wants, if we want to go around and just do last couple of thoughts on what do comp people need to think about, that'd be a great closing for today, I think.
I'll go.
Go ahead, please.
So, and then I'll toss it over to somebody, right? So I think be brave, right? Get in there and look at your analytics and just set the stage with your executive leadership that it is a process. We've got stuff I know I'm going to find. And, we as an organization need to decide how we want to handle this and give the information back to the employees. So that's my last thought is don't be afraid. Just dive right in. Okay, Jaime, you're next.
Yeah, I'll say that this is a discussion that it has to happen at the highest level of the organization. Why? Because it really touched the roots of the ethical, key essential ethical elements of what really the organization wants to prove and communicate the way they paint to the teams. So I'll say, don't take it to the mid-side. Just take it as high as you can because it is absolutely crucial.
I'll go. I would say most of you have already been doing pay equity. You've already been calling this out for years. You already recognize when there's inequities inside the organization. This is just the next level of finesse that we're adding, and you're codifying it, you're making it official, but it's not different than what you've done before. You already have a lot of the skills to help figure this out. Obviously, having a more, robust tool in place makes it much easier, but it's not different. It's not a change. It's just an expansion of what we've already been doing.
Yeah, I would say kind of a combination of, I think, what we're hearing, which is just start, dive in, jump in. And you have a great opportunity as the caretakers of so much of the employee value proposition, right? When you think about what you all are managing, I encourage you, it's fun. It's a new skill set maybe for some folks, but just dive in and get started. And there's lots of resources. And you've got a great bunch of folks here that I'm sure any one of us would be happy to answer any questions.
Nancy, you took all the words right out of my mouth. Those are all the things.
We're sharing a brain today, Jennifer.
Just get started. Yes, there's partners out there. You don't have to do it alone. You're not full projects. There's lots of resources, but I think it's also a great opportunity in the comp space to start communicating what we do. And this is a golden opportunity for the work that we do and to make impact, true impact, and have the attention of leaders. So that's kind of my push of just get started. Baby steps. You don't have to boil the ocean overnight. Just get started.
That's right.
No, really, really wonderful conversation today. And, if I were to leave it with a couple of comments, my final comments would be just to think about the next steps, think about planning towards it, kind of set the stage, set the expectations. We have to get started on this. This is not, I think, to the earlier point, this is not a question of if, but a question of when do you need to start. So proper planning, proper expectation setting, and talking to the right experts to really get you prepared for what that project may look like is probably the first steps I would recommend. So I think we'll continue to see the importance of this grow over time. And like everyone said, we've got some great experts here, any of which could help you with any projects that you're working on. And we'll we will be excited to chat next week, or I guess 2 weeks from now, where we'll be talking about how to build the relationship between TA and the compensation team. And that will be joined with Bonnie Dilber. So we'll look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks. And thanks to the panel for joining today. It was a really great conversation. And I look forward to the next one. All right.
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.